Welcome. Thank you all for coming. Sorry for the delay. And thanks to the College of General Studies, Dean Linda Wells, and the Faculty Research and Scholarship Committee for co-sponsoring this event. I should also express our gratitude to the UK Arts and Research Council for funding Michael's trip. Let me tell you how the next hour will unfold. Michael will speak for about 25 to 30 minutes, then that will be followed by a conversation with Professor Sally Summer-Smith, Professor Kaufman, and myself. Afterwards, we'll finish up with questions from the audience. I'll now formally introduce our speaker. Michael Parker is a professor of English literature at the University of Central Lancashire, a fellow of the English Association, and a reviewer for the Times Literary Supplement, Warwick Review, and Irish Studies Review. His publications include Seamus Heaney, The Making of the Poet, 1993, Contemporary Irish Fiction, Themes, Tropes, Theories, co-edited with Liam Hart, Northern Irish Literature, The Imprint of History, 1956 to 2006, and Irish Literature Since 1900, Diverse Voices, co-edited with Scott Brewster. He is now researching his next book, Seamus Heaney, Legacies, Afterlives, which is due out from Palgrave Macmillan in 2012. In his poem Motto, Bertolt Brecht raised a question. In the dark times, will there also be singing? He answers himself, yes, there will be singing about the dark times. The poet is not the only one who bears vocal witness to atrocity. It is also the work of a literary historian whose responsibility is to do more than just record the facts of a historical moment. The good literary historian shows an awareness of and sensitivity to the sensibilities of those whose imaginations are pressing back against the pressures of reality. Michael Parker is just such an historian. His work addresses the troubled intersection where politics, history, and literature meet. He bears eloquent and precise witness to the vagaries, horrors, and incomparable literary fertility that have defined Northern Ireland for the past 50 years. Records of dark times are often incomplete. The official inquiries into what happened, say, during Bloody Sunday some 40 years ago, have only recently made their findings public. It was in June of this year that the British Prime Minister David Cameron said he was deeply sorry for the killing of 13 marchers on 30 January 1972 in Londonderry, when British paratroopers opened fire on crowds at a civil rights demonstration. In the meantime, Irish poets have written about their version of these events and others that have marked or marred their sensibilities. In fact, poems themselves might be the only evidence that such an event has occurred. They sometimes exist for us as the sole trace of a politically unpalatable occurrence. I know Michael as a painstaking researcher. His method of integrating published materials, archives, letters, and interviews to modify and contest the perspectives of published accounts, both literary and historical, yields a truly impressive body of scholarship. His work deserves sustained attention from all of us who are engaged in remapping the important features of contemporary Irish literary and historical studies, all of us who are still remembering and thinking and singing about the dark times. I welcome Michael Parker.
So I'd like to begin by thanking Meg Tyler and her colleagues for inviting me here and giving this opportunity to speak to you. Meg mentioned the importance of historical contextualization in my work, and I owe certainly a debt to Marilyn Richterick from the University of Georgia State University in Atlanta for providing a model for the kinds of things that I wanted to do, and also I've benefited hugely from Meg and her close reading of poetry, so there'll be something of her coming across in this as well. And also Bernard O'Donoghue, a very distinguished poet and critic. Okay. Now, it's quite common to find some people who imagine that the conflict in Northern Ireland is at an end. I attended a conference in Paris in 2007 in which one distinguished European authority on Irish literature spoke about the border between the Irish Republic and Northern Ireland disappearing, and how the two parts of Ireland were virtually united. Certainly the security situation has improved vastly as a result of the collaborative efforts of Irish, British and American governments and the acceptance by the often antagonistic northern political parties that working together in government will enhance the lives of people in their communities. And yet, 16 years after the Provisional IRA called their ceasefire in August 1994, 12 years after the Good Friday Agreement, 3 years since the St Andrews Agreement restored power sharing in Northern Ireland and ended direct rule from Westminster, there are still signs of old wounds and animosities unhealed. In a recent interview with Jody Allen Randolph, the poet Michael Longley puts it bluntly. There has been a political agreement, but cultural reconciliation remains a long way off. The tensions which engendered the Troubles are still with us. The walls that keep the tribes apart along the so-called peace line in Belfast have not been taken down. Both parties at the talks seemed primarily concerned to make a deal that would satisfy our people. They exposed how little they have done on the collective language of a shared future. And in a sense, I could say that Northern Irish writers especially are trying to develop that collective language of a shared future in their own individual ways. The dissident Republicans who carried out the Omagh bombing on the 15th of August 1998 clearly remained and remain utterly unreconciled to the changed politics brought about as a result of George Mitchell's patient diplomacy. Ominously, over the last 2 years, dissident Republicans have greatly increased the intensity and frequency of their attacks. On the 7th of March 2009, 2 British soldiers in their early 20s were shot dead by the real IRA at the Mazarine barracks in Antrim. There are 2 major dissident Republican groups, the real IRA and the Continuity IRA. 2 days later, on the 9th of March 2009, in Craigavon, the Continuity IRA murdered a police officer, Stephen Carroll. Summer 2009 saw arson attacks on the homes of 2 leading members of Sinn Féin, Mitchell McLaughlin and Conor Murphy. And during the autumn and winter months, the police service were repeatedly targeted. Dissidents left 2 huge bombs, one of £600 in South Armagh, the other of £400 outside the Policing Board HQ in Belfast, in the hope that they would cause multiple casualties. There's been no let-up of incidents through the first half of 2010, which has seen regular gun and bomb attacks on police stations. In January of this year, as a result of injuries caused by a car bomb, Peter Heffron, a 33-year-old police officer, had to have a leg amputated. In late February, the Real IRA murdered Kieran Doherty, one of its own members. And a month or so back, a pipe bomb was thrown into primary school grounds. Now, these are the kind of incidents that were very common in the 1990s. And I also checked up on the BBC website the other day, and it mentioned that a number of people being arrested for having weapons in their vehicle and being suspected members of one of the dissident groups. Now, Northern Irish writers have continued to respond to the political situation and to the hurt accrued over the last 4 decades. Though not surprisingly, personal concerns are often much to the fore these days. In this brief stocktake, I'd like to draw your attention to 2 recent pieces of literature which demonstrate the continuing depth and quality of Northern Irish writing and the continuing grip of the past. The first of these is David Park's prize-winning novel, The Truth Commissioner, from 2008, which is set at some unspecific time in the near future when a Truth and Reconciliation Commission has been set up in Northern Ireland, following the example of South Africa. The Truth Commissioner closely reflects the politically fraught historical juncture in which it was composed, a period in which numerous tribunals and inquiries were established in Northern Ireland, in Britain, and in Ireland in order to attempt to get at the truth of contentious events in the distant and recent past. One thinks, for example, as Meg has mentioned, of the Savile inquiry into the killings on Bloody Sunday, which was commissioned in 1998 but only reported in 2010. There was also the 2004 inquiry into the murder of Belfast solicitor Pat Finucane, who defended Republicans accused of crimes, and whether Pat Finucane was murdered as a result of collusion between loyalist paramilitaries and the security forces. There have also been various inquiries surrounding the Iraq War and the legality of the British government's decision to take part in the invasion of Iraq, and various tribunals in Ireland looking into corrupt practices, such as the bribing of politicians by property developers and other sections of the business elite. And so Park's novel reflects attempts at a damage limitation adopted by many of the interested parties in such high-profile cases, and how witnesses may be heavily coached beforehand to ensure that, inverted commas, acceptable narratives emerge in their testimony rather than the truth, which might threaten the post-Good Friday, post-St Andrews status quo by setting their brutal misdeeds and fatal misjudgments back into the spotlight of public scrutiny. In The Truth Commissioner, it's a young man's untimely death which is central to the novel's plot, and a focus of investigation by its Commissioner for Truth and Reconciliation. 15-year-old Connor Walsh is one of the disappeared and is believed to have been shot by Republican paramilitaries for passing information to the RUC. His case comes to prominence in the Commission's work due to the pressure exerted by his sister Maria and his mother. In the emotional early scene in which the two women plead with the Commissioner, Henry Stanfield, to try to get Connor's body back so that we can bury him, there are clear echoes of the conflict between familial pietas and state policy in Sophocles' Antigone, which had recently been revived on stage by Seamus Heaney in his play The Burial at Thebes. Like Polynices, the dead brother in that play, Connor's been denied the sacred rites of burial because of what the dominant forces in the community, here the Provisional IRA, regard as an unforgivable act of disloyalty. As in Antigone, the actions of one of its members opens a deep rift in the family, as Mrs. Walsh reveals. It's a quotation on the slide. The rest of the family don't want us to go through with this, the oldest boys especially. They say we're just stirring up more trouble for ourselves. And yet it's the persistence and determination of Maria, aided by the Truth Commissioner's own daughter, Emma, which finally leads to an account of Connor's final days and hours, and the callous way he was used and abused by competing authorities. Significantly, the guilty parties in the novel are all male. They are Henry Stanfield, the cynical and self-interested commissioner who's taken on the post in order to further his career. There's Francis Gilroy, a former senior member of the Provisional IRA, now the Minister for Children and Culture in the devolved government. And there's obviously a kind of parallel there to a certain extent with Martin McGuinness. There's James Fenton, who's a retired officer from the Royal Ulster Constabulary and now spends his time as a part-time charity worker at a Romanian orphanage. So you can see this sort of child motif emerging there, who had blackmailed Connor into providing intelligence. And finally, the least culpable character, Michael Madden, who would have been roughly the same age as Connor Walsh, the victim, former junior member of the IRA, who fled the North and took on a new identity, working as a groundsman on an American university campus in the novel. He was there at Connor's last hours, but at the crucial moment in the novel, and I don't want to tell you too much about the novel because I hope you'll read it, he misidentifies who Connor's killer really was. Now, what enhances the novel is the deft narrative technique that Park employs in a quest for what might or might not be the absolute truth. The focalization in this novel is constantly changing, making readers active participants in the creation of meanings, tempting them into judgments, speculations, interpretations, and fostering a degree of empathy for the protagonists and their present suffering, for the devastating mistakes in their past. I'd like to just give a brief flavour of the novel. Appropriately at the beginning, it's Connor's whose are the perspectives we encounter in the opening chapter. The opening line of the novel is an interesting one, and I think it's, yes, it is on there. He's never been anywhere he's never been. This is the novel's curiously circular opening statement, and it immediately marks the unnamed characters and the reader's descent into a defamiliarizing world. We gradually try to piece together clues as to who this speaker is. Characteristically in Trouble's texts, the North is invoked as a labyrinthine space where physical, cultural, and psychological, quote, boundaries are fixed and mind narrowed into a meshed grid of, wrong page, wounds and animosities that are unhealed. Oh, no, sorry, that's the photocopy has done something twice. Beg your pardon. I wonder if it's printed it all twice. Meshed grid of streets. I knew we'd get there eventually. A meshed grid of streets. So this idea of mind narrow, there's sort of echo of Louis MacNeice there, you know, the blinded minds he talks about in one of his poems. There are indications that Connor, early on, is a petty criminal, and later that curiosity has been an important motivation in his housebreaking career. Like us, quote, he liked being in other people's houses, stepping into someone else's world. Self-reflexive touch there, and this is what we do as readers, of course. Yet we learn that he is wedged between two men and quickly deduce that he's been abducted by paramilitaries, despite the ambiguity of lines like, he knows them to see and what they're part of. Endowed with the privilege of hindsight, aware of how paramilitaries in the 1970s treated informers, or touts as they were called, readers are conscious of the terrible peril of his situation, which fosters empathy for this naive, trapped boy. At the close, his voice is finally heard in the novel without the mediating additions of a sensitive, hidden narrator. In the commission, a cassette is played, recorded by his interrogators, which has a hugely dramatic impact on all of the characters. Actually, it emerges that they've recorded his interrogation in order to use it for propaganda purposes, in order to deter other people from speaking to the security forces, either the army or the RUC, the police. This concern with unfinished history is one Seamus Heaney addresses in his latest collection, Human Chain. And at this point, I should give a warning that my comments are going to be provisional, in that I haven't done a completely thorough analysis of the whole book, but I've tried to talk about a few poems that I do feel comfortable with, and so I hope you'll gain something from it. In poem 9 of Route 110, Heaney turns from episodes from his personal history as a child, adolescent, and young adult to confront past violence and present injustices in Northern Ireland. And this is the poem itself. Interestingly, in my researches so far in Boston, I discovered that this poem actually wasn't in the sequence Route 110 was mostly written before Heaney had his stroke, which I'll be talking about later. So most of the poems were there. But interestingly, there was another poem which was later removed, and this poem therefore must be a much later addition. In so doing, in taking on this political concern in a book which is frequently intensely private in its focus, he takes on once more the injunction laid on by Czeslaw Miłosz and by John Hewitt, who wrote in the week after Bloody Sunday a poem which began with the line, "Bear in mind these dead." And that word bear I'm going to come back to. So, as with the rest of the poems, what I'd like to try and do is to read each one of them so that you've got it in front of you and you can see what I'm trying to do with the poem and to interpret it. So, poem 9. And what in the end was there left to bury of Mr. Lavery, blown up in his own pub, as he bore the prime device and bears it still, mid-morning towards the sun-admitting door of Ashley House? Or of Louis O'Neill, in the wrong place, the Wednesday they buried 13 who'd been shot in Derry? Or of bodies unglorified, accounted for and bagged behind the grief cordons, not to be laid in war graves with full honours, nor in a separate plot, fired on over anniversaries by units drilled and spruce and unreconciled? In a collection which embodies and celebrates the power of enduring memory, this poem constitutes a brief but eloquent act of redress for those whose appalling deaths in the Troubles go largely unremembered, and pointedly contrasts their fate with that of the fallen combatants in the struggle. Beneficiaries of full honours, soldierly ritual, yearly memorialisation, the paramilitaries occupy plots which separate them from the ordinary dead. Significantly, the two men singled out and commemorated here were murdered by bombs planted by paramilitaries. Both were also personally known to Heaney and died at a critical juncture in his and in the province's history. Respectfully referred to as Mr. Lavery, John F. Lavery was a 60-year-old Catholic who owned a pub on a junction of the Lisburn Road in South Belfast, a mere 20 yards or so from the Heaney's house on 16 Ashley Avenue. He died at around 11:30 a.m. on the 21st of December 1971, while trying to remove from the premises a £20 bomb which had been deposited there, in all probability by the Provisional IRA. 2 days before Lavery's death, Heaney had received a card from John Hewitt, which referred to a recent discussion with friends in which, quote, our safe frustrations were compared with the fates of those, quote, folk in the firing line. So Hewitt was emphasising the way in which certain middle-class areas of Belfast were free of violence, whereas in working-class districts especially, there were folk in the firing line. The fact that the explosion occurred so close to their home may well have influenced the Heaney's decision in January 1972 to move their young family out of Belfast. And again, I've come across evidence that in this killing of Mr. Lavery occurred just before Christmas, late December 1971, I've discovered that by mid-January 1972, the Heaneys were thinking about moving to Wicklow. They'd been in touch with Anne Saddlemeyer about moving there. Excuse me. At the beginning of February 1972, while still reeling from the killings of Bloody Sunday, Heaney learnt of the death of Louis O'Neill, a regular customer in my father-in-law's public house in Arbo, Heaney writes in Stepping Stones, who had initiated the poet into eel fishing. The 49-year-old O'Neill had been drinking in the Imperial Bar in Stewartstown, County Tyrone, on the night of the 3rd of February, when a blast from a 15-pound bomb planted by loyalist paramilitaries killed him instantly. In Human Chain, as opposed to Casualty, an earlier poem about him, O'Neill comes across as wholly victim, someone caught in the wrong place. This phrase does not appear in the earlier published version of the poem, in a collection called The Riverbank Field, a small gallery press publication, but it represents an interesting addition. That phrase, the wrong place, it prompts the reader to add at the wrong time, but then perhaps to go further. The unidentified location of the bombing, like the Derry streets, like the whole province, is a place where terrible wrong has been and continues to be committed. Structure, sound, imagery, and diction all play a key role in containing the poem's emotion, in generating ironies, in charging the reader to write, W-R-I-T-E, and write, to write, R-I-G-H-T, meaning. Poem 9 consists of 4 tercets and 3 questions, and turns critically on line 9 when the contrasting fate of the different war dead is broached. Mortality and finality are emphasised in the shock of the opening line, where 3 of the 4 stresses fall on words that are semantically and hourly linked: end, left, and bury. This attunes us to the poem's play with rhythm and resonance, its deployment of alliteration and assonance, full and half rhymes. Bury, Lavery, bore, door, still, O'Neill, device, house, place. Buried, Derry, what, not, plot. Words are strategically placed for sound effect, like the prime device which sits in the middle of line 3, encircled by plosive B's and P's. There's clearly the influence of Meg Tyler operating in some of this description. The verb choice here is in itself significant. To bear belongs to a higher register than to carry or to take, and suggests something altogether grander and more heroic. It's a verb encountered in several phrases highly pertinent to the poem as a whole, enduring phrases such as bearing the brunt, bearing arms, bearing the consequence, bearing responsibility, and bearing witness, a sign that Heaney is bearing in mind Hewitt's appealed to bear in mind these dead. That this individual, this action, this moment exists in the speaker's present is conveyed by the forward movement in tense, an idea reinforced by the choice of and placing of the adverb. As so often in Wordsworth's and Yeats's poems, the word still bears a double meaning, and here conjures a brief cameo picture of Lavery's careful, tentative act. Lines 4 and 5 add a dimension of dark irony through their references to the sun-admitting door, since through that same door less welcome visitors had passed, and also to Ashley House, which the bomb reduced to dust and rubble. The door metaphor opens the way first to O'Neill, and then to whose murder and guiltlessness links him to the 13 shot in Derry, and then on to other countless bomb victims whose killings might equally be said to have occurred in the wake of Bloody Sunday. After their deaths, the imagery implies they suffer further violence. They are de-individualized, referred to as bodies, reduced to the status of commodities, which are accounted for and bagged, of irretrievably damaged goods. In his revision to the version in the Riverbank Fields, Heaney enhances the weightiness of two key words by moving them in the poem. In the text of Human Chain, bodies is placed at the hinge point of lines 7 and 8, while unglorified is repositioned at the start of line 8, and as a consequence acquires an important change in stress. So what we would normally say is unglorified becomes unglorified. The unusual polysyllable thus becomes pivotal in and to the poem's closing comparisons, in which these forgotten civilians figure as the not, and nor people, consigned to invisibility behind the grief cordons, confined now to plots largely unvisited. Those who may very well bear responsibility for ending their lives, meanwhile, are honoured, celebrated, translated by their well-drilled, smartly kitted out replacements. The poem's last word defines this new generation of paramilitaries as unreconciled, though as to what, the reader again is encouraged to speculate. Unreconciled to the loss of fallen comrades, to the end of the military struggle, to the partition of Ireland, to the use of constitutional means and power sharing in advance, to advance or maintain their objectives, to responsibility for the deaths of innocent civilians. These are all possible readings. The new volume Human Chain is the first published since Heaney's stroke in the August of 2006. At around 8 o'clock in the morning, after a party to celebrate Anne Friel's birthday, when Heaney attempted to get out of bed, he quickly realised that something was seriously amiss. In an interview, he said, "I made to move, but I couldn't move." Fortunately, amongst the other guests were two highly experienced medics who were able to give a swift diagnosis, immediate hospitalisation. Immediate byproduct of this stroke episode was the poem Miracle, which by miracle is there in front of you. And I'd like to talk a little bit about this and the way in which it draws an analogy between his recent traumatic experience and an incident in Luke's Gospel where the loyal friends of a paralysed man lower him down on a stretcher into Christ's presence. From the outset, attention is fixed not on the one who walks away, but on those ones who made the restoration possible. The narrating voice stresses the strain their burden exacts upon them, their shoulders, their backs and hands aching with no let-up until he's strapped on tight, made tiltable and raised to the hot tiles, then lowered for healing. there's the very important image of hands. Throughout Human Chain, hands become a key symbol for the human connection. After the densely packed alliteration and assonance in this stanza, note the repetition of the L's, the T's, the P's and the R's, and the vowel pairing in tight and tiles, made and raised, and the triple movement, tiltable, raised, lowered. An aural and matching physical release comes in the poem's close. Slipping in an allusion to Milton, the speaker instructs us to be mindful of the service given by those who, quote, stand and wait. Whereas St. Luke emphasises how all those who witnessed the miracle were seized with amazement and awe, Heaney's focus is solely on the sick man's companions, who are depicted far less dramatically. The slight lightheadedness and incredulity they experience constitutes a minor and temporary reaction. What he celebrates here, in an understated, Hardy-esque style, is a completely secular marvel, the salvaging rather than the salvation of a life. It's the miracle that he has such friends that moves him, not wonder at the intercession of Christ. In terms of the human chain in the title, it's an obvious thing for us to reflect upon, and I think it operates in a number of ways, which demonstrate Heaney's deftness as a structural, conceptual, linguistic, and musical craftsman. First of all, the human chain refers to familial and generational links, connections with the home locale and with the dead generations that Robert Emmett refers to. Human interdependency it also refers to, and the solidarity, such as in this poem, Miracle. The solidarity that his wife shows with him on the journey to hospital that he talks about very movingly in a poem called Chanson d'Aventure. The solidarity of aid workers in the title poem. And there again, particularly, we see this image of the hand as that supportive gesture. And in this poem, Chanson d'Aventure, he talks about, because of the stroke, his hand is sort of flopped and dead. And he talks about the way in which his wife takes his fixed hand in hers. Also, I think human chain refers to the burden of the physical, the idea of the constraints of the body. I think also there may be a kind of Blakean element to it, in that in Blake's paintings, etchings that go with the songs of innocence and experience, frequently you see these chained figures who are trying to rise up. So chain is associated with sort of mortality and spiritual deadness. Throughout the poem, the chains also refer to the way in which poems are paired and coupled. And again, interesting, if you look on the page, the opposite human chain, let me just check in this edition. The poems actually operate, particularly at the beginning, in pairs. The human chain, for example, is opposite, on the opposite page, to the poem Miracle. And lastly, there are word chains, sound chains, semantic clusters, and repetitions within poems and across poems. So there's a kind of chain effect. Time?
So, a few more minutes of talking about the poems, and then we'll break into a conversation.
Okay, fair enough. Right. Right, having given a sort of summary of some of the ways in which the chain operates, perhaps I'll turn to the later poems, and then I'll call it a day. So I'll miss that one out. This is a picture of Margaret Heaney, who this next poem is about, a poem called Uncoupled, which hopefully is there. Right. So I'll just talk about two poems, and then I'm out of here. Metaphorically. I'm out of here. Right. The very title poem, Uncoupled, one of several depicting his parents, emphasises separation, disconnection, the wife's from the husband because of the distinct gender roles in the 1940s and 1950s, and parents from children. In the opening of the first of this diptych, the opposite one depicts his father. There's a tension between his ennobling portrayal of his mother, she's translated into a kind of priestess, and the humbleness of her daily ritual, carrying the ashes from the fire. Maintaining domestic warmth, she's literally and metaphorically a keeper of the flame. To save time, I won't read it, but I'll just comment on it. The opening question, who is this, alludes to lines from Keats's Ode to a Grecian Urn, and there's a great deal of Keats in this particular collection. He was one of the poets who Heaney first bonded with when he was studying at St. Colum's in the sixth form. However, unlike Keats's narrator facing a cultural text he cannot decode, Heaney's knows the answer, can now as an adult read the signs. Patriarchal ideology has determined that the mother bears up, accepts her burden, and in her commitment to the family is unwavering. Again, a recurrent feature of this collection is that use of unforms. That word's placing at the start of line 9 intensifies its weight. It's her defining, heroic, enduring, steady, steadfast quality. Heaney's speaker confers a dignity on her, but is conscious also of her subject status, the sore she suffers, the worn path she treads. The use of the present continuous tense, coming, walking, bearing, blowing, and the simple present, proceeds and turns, adds to the immediacy of the vision, though at the close the past tense, have lost, signals a loss which the unidentified collective we share. Chains of recurring sounds, W's, B's, S's, F's, P's and H's, constitute a kind of aural frame which sustains the visual elements. The references to dust and ash in her mouth and eyes, the final image of her disappearing from the children's view, makes this another poem of portents. As he revives her and her spirit through a willed act of imagination, he does so knowing what is to come, her uncoupling from her husband and children in 1984. In her book, The Breaking of Style, Helen Vendler writes about a poem from seeing things in terms that might be equally applicable here. A setting is now re-seen in the retrospect of age, as portending, at the time as it was experienced, even if one did not in the past moment recognise the portent in the setting. Or to quote the end of part 1's companion piece on the other side of the page, quote, I know the pain of loss before I know the term. Okay, so what I'd like to do then is to end with an uplifting poem. A Kate for Aveen. There are lots of very weighty poems that, had I but a further 3 hours to talk about, I could expound upon. But I thought I would end with a bit of uplift as the collection ends. So I think I will read this one, if I'm allowed. Air from another life and time and place, pale blue heavenly air is supporting a white wing beating high against the breeze. And yes, it's a kite, as when one afternoon all of us there trooped out among the briar hedges and stripped thorn. I take my stand again, halt opposite Anahorish Hill to scan the blue, back in that field to launch our long-tailed comet. And now it hovers, tugs, veers, dives askew, lifts itself, goes with the wind until it rises to loud cheers from us below. Rises, and my hand is like a spindle unspooling, the kite a thin-stemmed flower, climbing and carrying farther, higher the longing in the breast and planted feet and gazing face and heart of the kite flyer, until string breaks, and separate, elate, the kite takes off, itself alone, a windfall. So just to conclude, so what is this kite? Is it an emblem of the soul released from the body? Is it an emblem of the fragile body? Is it the poem? Is it the collection, a windfall in itself, launched and detached from its earth-tied, ground-chained kite runner? Is it the poet letting go, as he puts it in the title poem, once and for all? And lastly, that image of the spindle I think is interesting, because we associate the spindle, don't we, with the Greek fates, the kite taking off, the string being broken. Is this a kind of image of death? At the same time, the spindle is something that you associate with female domestic work, say in the 18th, 19th and early 20th century. an image of creative female labour. And one of the things that sort of strikes me in the poems, although the father is a more recurring presence in the collection, Human Chain, there's also a very strong sense of the importance of women, and the way in which this poem itself, the sequence I refer to, Route 110, ends with a poem dedicated to his granddaughter Anna Rose, part of the new generation, and this one, A Kite for a Veen, is for his second granddaughter. Okay, thank you very much. Sorry if I gave you too much history.
So now we'll start the conversational segment of the hour, and I would just like to start by asking Michael how you became interested in Seamus Heaney and his work.
Good. I was hoping you'd... Oh, rather echoey. I was hoping you'd start with a simple question. What happened was that I'd been working in Poland for a couple of years, and I should go back a little way. I come from a Catholic family and was the youngest of 6, and the only one of the 6 who was blessed with not being sent to a Catholic school. And I remember as an 11-year-old having to sit in on a religious knowledge session where the teacher would ask the students 20 questions every week. And one of the questions was, name a saint. I think it might have been name a Catholic saint. And one poor soul said Guy Fawkes, who, as you were, sort of tried to blow up Parliament. And what was curious as an 11-year-old was that the teacher said to me, well, would you regard Guy Fawkes as a saint? And that kind of maybe was the sort of start of thinking differently about things. And obviously I wouldn't say he was a saint because he was a terrorist. At the same time, he was part of a Catholic minority who were ruthlessly treated under Elizabeth I at the end of her reign and James I, but that aside. So anyway, at school, at the secondary school I went to, which was also not Catholic, we did history in the 6th form, and I particularly felt attracted towards Irish history. Daniel O'Connell, Parnell, and also I think around about the same sort of time my mother started, who had an Irish grandmother, started visiting Ireland, and I remember her getting me some stamps from the 1916 to commemorate the 1916 Rising. So anyway, Ireland became an interest, and at university I studied Yeats. He was the only Irish writer we looked at, and then at the end of the 1970s, I went to Poland for 2 years, and going to a country with a kind of strong, where the Catholics were the majority, this was a novelty for me, where nationalism was extremely important, where there was a kind of, oh, you do it so well, where nationalism, Catholicism, politics, there was a whole kind of cluster of concerns there. So anyway, when I came back from Poland, I was very interested in this conjunction of politics, religion, history, literature, and when I was casting around for what to do for some research, I attended a reading by. I went to a reading where Ted Hughes was the number one speaker, and when Ted Hughes walked into the room, it was like you were in the presence of Mother Teresa or somebody. There was a kind of complete hush. But the warm-up back to cut it shorter. The warm-up act to Ted Hughes was this genial Irishman who read these really interesting poems. And so when I went back to the university, I said, I'd like to do some work on this Seamus Heaney. So it kind of arose out of that. But a crucial event was going to a teacher's. I used to work in secondary schools until about 1990, in high schools, as you'd call it. And I went to a meeting for teachers where, just like at university, which I loved, somebody handed out some poems and said to us, okay, start talking about them. And the poem they handed us was a poem called Limbo. I don't know if you're familiar with. I brought it just in case this question would be asked. And I thought this way I'll get to read another poem. But this is it. Fishermen at Ballyshannon netted an infant last night, along with the salmon, an illegitimate spawning, a small one thrown back to the waters. But I'm sure she stood in the shallows, ducking him tenderly, till the frozen knobs of her wrists were dead as the gravel. He was a minnow with hooks, tearing her open. She waded in under the sign of the cross. Under the sign of the cross. He was hauled in with the fish. Now limbo will be a cold glitter of souls through some far briny zone. Even Christ's palms unhealed, smart and cannot fish there. Now the two things that really affected me very strongly was there this image of a woman who's killing her child because it's an illegitimate child, ducking him tenderly. I thought it was astonishing the use of the adverb tenderly there. And also I thought about those last lines, even Christ's palms unhealed, smart and cannot fish there. I thought, theologically, how could there possibly be a place where Christ's palms cannot fish, cannot heal? And it made me think of the monstrousness of the concept of limbo as this place where unbaptized children are sent. So it kind of fed into a kind of hostility to conventional Catholic theology. So my interest in Heaney is strongly linked to both the history, the Catholicism, but above all, it's the sheer power, astonishing power of the poetry and the fact that he was able to write such wonderful poems at such a young age and continues to write such wonderful poems.
Thank you. Has your faith changed shape over the years, reading Heaney as a companion?
No, I'm quite interested in his attitude towards the notion of belief and faith, and I was interested in the way in which in Stepping Stones, when he was interviewed by Dennis O'Driscoll, who's clearly an atheist, is trying to push him into saying, right, death, the end, full stop. But interestingly, Heaney gives some sort of resistance to that. And also in the film made by RTE in 2009, Out of the Marvellous, he also talks about death as a kind of crossing. So I think Heaney probably is, strictly speaking, an unbeliever in terms of the Catholic faith, but he's somebody who still has a profound sense of the transcendent, which is, again, partly why I chose that poem to end with, because it is air, blue, heavenly, and I can think of certain academic critics in Boston who would probably have slapped his wrist for writing in such a way.
Thank you. Chris.
I think Limbo is an interesting poem to bring into the discussion because it strikes me that it's breaking another sort of faith also, in that it begins with that word fisherman, which of course takes us to Yeats a little bit, and Heaney's sort of engaging that in a way that maybe some of his contemporaries wouldn't have, or some of his predecessors wouldn't have. But I'd also, sort of thinking about your last comment, a lot of times in Heaney's collections, the final poem anticipates some of the places he's going to go next. And I've always thought of him as a poet, very elemental, but mostly attached to water and to earth, and the bog poems and so forth. Is there something airier in what he's up to now in general, or is he heading somewhere airier? Do you anticipate?
I know from sort of material I've come across recently, there's a poem called Hindsight that was going to appear in Human Chain, which he describes as a counter to Miracle that I read. So I don't think one can ever be sure, and I don't think he's ever sure where things are going to go next. Again, from things I've read recently and earlier, I sense that with each collection, there's a huge effort goes into the final crafting of it. And I'm glad you mentioned Yeats. I noticed the way in which, from Wintering Out onwards, his collections are very carefully constructed, just as Yeats's collections were. And there's a kind of sort of circularity, there's a kind of chain operating there. So, but I think he's got to a stage, Human Chain, as it were. This kite is now floating out into the ether. I don't think he quite knows where he's going next, which is part of the delights of his poetry, because although certain ill-informed or ill-tempered critics try and just talk about him as if he's simply deeply conservative, writing out of this rural rut and out of this kind of primitive faith system, his poems I find constantly surprise and do different things and go to different places. So, for example, again, you mentioned the elements. Air is something which, in sort of earlier interviews, he would associate with being in America as a different kind of. He talks about sort of walking on air, doesn't he, when he came over to work in Harvard. The way in which he's able to sort of displace himself. And I think that's part of the richness of his work, is that he's constantly trying to. He revisits certain of the same ground, certainly, but he's also going in different directions, and he's through things like the act of translation, he is translating himself and taking his poetry in different directions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Let me ask a little bit about the aesthetics of Heaney's poetry as it relates to music. Heaney has had a long relationship with the piper Liam O'Flynn and has appeared with him reading poetry while the piper has played traditional Irish music. He has recorded with Liam O'Flynn an album in which O'Flynn will play Irish traditional airs interspersed with Heaney reading his own poetry, some of the best known poetry that he has written. And also O'Flynn and other Irish traditional musicians have kind of adopted Heaney by naming some of their tunes and some of their albums actually after lines from his work. Say the given note, for example, is a line from a well-remembered line from one of his poems that graces the title of, or is the title, I should say, of a well-known traditional album. What is the relationship between Seamus Heaney and Irish traditional music, do you think?
Well, I think it'll be strongly linked to that sense of a distinctive cultural tradition that he's coming out of. That he went to Anna Horridge School, then he went to St Columb's, he went to Queen's University. Queen's University, I think he encountered relatively few, because Queen's University is obviously part of a British education system. He would have encountered relatively few Irish writers. And as I said, in my own education, we got Yeats, who we kind of half classed as English anyway, because he spent half his life in London. I didn't say that, he wiped that. But no, so I think it's very much bound up with a sense of his distinct cultural identity. The first time I interviewed him, interview is probably too grand a word for it, but I talked to his I asked him about this kind of Catholic background. He said the way in which he was trying to he was trying to increase. He said, English literature is primarily dominated by Protestant voices. In a way, I think that the connection with music is to do with an assertion of distinctness, of cultural identity, of tradition, which has a kind of political reverberations. He's also has an absolute incredible memory for songs and tunes. His wife is a fantastic singer. He had this very important relationship starting in 1964 with the folk singer David Hammond. They went together on tour in 1968 in the Room to Rhyme tour supported by the Arts Council of Northern Ireland. So there is this kind of profound bond I think he has with traditional music, traditional Irish music. And to say a little bit about the David Hammond connection, I think probably because he regularly attended concerts and was with David Hammond, then I just think that enhanced his awareness of tradition and history. And as I say, I think particularly from 1968 onwards, when there begins to be the breakdown in Northern Ireland, and you get and also once the British troops come in and begin to identify more, I think, with they would line up with their backs to the Unionists and Loyalists and face the Nationalists. I think there's that kind of element there as well. It's he talks, doesn't he, in one of the interviews about taking the sonnet and making it eat stuff that it's never eaten before. In a way, what I think he's trying to do through his relationship with music is to assert with pride that sense of Irish cultural identity. Because really, at the time, I'm just thinking back to the Irish in Britain, for example, in the 1950s. Frequently, there would be signs, and before the 1950s as well, there'd be signs on guest houses: no dogs, no Irish, no blacks. So there's that sense, and the Irish in Britain had that strong sense of being regarded as inferiors. And what I think an important contribution of Irish musicians, Irish artists, Irish poets and novelists and playwrights has been to restore a sense of dignity and assert the cultural value of their traditions, as opposed to the two hugely powerful traditions either side, in terms of English or British traditions and American tradition.
In doing so, however, in espousing or in adopting this Irish cultural heritage, Heaney is really performing a revolutionary act, is he not? I am aware of the very fine musician and journalist Fintan Vallely, who a couple of years ago in a book asserted that in Northern Ireland, Protestants have turned their backs on their their Irish cultural identity, and actually resist anything that can be defined as an Irish cultural icon or part of their heritage.
I think that may be an over-exaggeration in terms of, I mean, I always feel slightly worried about lumping all Catholics or lumping all Protestants together in Ireland. And certainly a key figure was David Hammond, who was from a Protestant background. His family were from the country, and when they settled in Belfast, they kind of never felt they totally settled there. But interestingly, when I interviewed David Hammond, he defined himself as Irish. So I think there are so many different gradations within Irish Protestantism, and in particular in the nonconformist tradition. I think that fits in, that is something which Heaney could identify. And if you look at the history of the Troubles, frequently the nonconformists and the Catholics, both in the 1960s and also back in 1798, frequently had a kind of common cause.
You speak with, I think, very convincing authority about the historical background of Heaney's poems, and yet I wonder, do you ever experience any qualms about writing about a living author? I do most of my work on living poets, and I'm a little worried sometimes about what I say and what might be read by them. Do you worry about that? And what are the pitfalls of writing about someone who's still alive, who can read what you're writing and talking about?
Okay, well, I'll answer that in sort of two ways. The first way is that I remember one of my colleagues at the first university I worked in who was doing stuff on George Eliot. And she was doing her PhD on George Eliot. And I remember going to the Liverpool University Library and going along rack after rack of books about George Eliot. And that made me think, well, I'm doing the right thing writing about a living poet, because there isn't all that much out there. And when I kind of started off, the great thing about a living author is that there's new ground. You're to a certain extent, or I was at the beginning anyway, there isn't a lot out there, and so you can make an original contribution. And also about a living author is that the narrative is constantly changing and developing, so you're almost kind of growing up and watching these transitions. And in a way, my experience with Seamus Heaney collections is a bit like my experience with the Beatles album. You don't know what's going to happen next, and there's this kind of shock surprise of when they come out with Strawberry Fields Forever or something and go in a new direction. But in terms of the pitfalls about a living author, then it is very difficult. It's like, as you know, if you write a review and you think you may encounter this particular poet at a conference or giving a reading or something, that can have a factor. But basically, I think you write what you feel. And as a reviewer, and when I write the literary criticism, I'm thinking, well, I'm saying what I think is, I'm giving my response to this poem. And I think in every collection of poems, for example, there are a number of ones that will stay with you and that you will cherish. There are some poems that you think you think, well, I'm not going to bother writing about that because it's not really doing anything for me. So, but I think it's important as in writing about literature is to acknowledge the huge effort that has gone into this work. You may not like it, but you have a duty to recognise what it is that this writer is attempting to do. I mean, my favourite word used to be attempt or tries to, because sometimes it doesn't come off. It's like your own writing. Sometimes it's just not there, but you've got to applaud the attempt. But it is difficult, and with Heaney what I've done is he looks at biographical stuff, historical stuff, and tells me whether I've misidentified that it's not his uncle, it's not this uncle, it's his grandfather or whatever. Okay. I also send him the literary critical stuff, but he doesn't. He kind of gives me a very general response on that. He doesn't say to me, "Oh no, you can't do that." But in some ways it's difficult, as you say, writing about a living poet, especially if you're in correspondence or you meet them. I sometimes simply like the pleasure of writing about people who I've never met. So recently I wrote about 5 American poets because I knew nothing about any of these poets, and that way you can give a sort of raw response to them. The only thing I knew about them was that 2 of them had translated Czesław Miłosz, so I knew they couldn't be all bad. And they weren't bad, sorry. They weren't bad at all. They were very good. They were very interesting. But sometimes it is a pleasure not having that burden of the historical knowledge and the background and all the sort of family and love life stuff.
It strikes me that, well, first of all, I absolutely agree with you that looking at contemporary poets, it's fascinating, or authors of in any genre, it's fascinating to see sort of what's coming next and the unpredictability of that. But I also feel like sometimes the chains, to pull on this book, between poems within a collection or even more across collections offer a way to ground something that's happening in the latest book in terms of what came before. And I see Heaney doing this not only in terms of the national and personal histories that you talked about, but also in terms of others. And it seems to me in this book, one of the central presences, and indeed one that's anticipated by some of his earlier work, is Virgil. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering, because most students here begin with a study of classics, if you could say something about Heaney's fascination with Virgil as it's expressed recently, or maybe his attraction to classical material.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it goes back to the fact that when he was studying at St. Columb's, I think Latin was one of his strongest subjects. And he said in interviews that he remembers his Latin teacher. I think they were doing book 2 of the Aeneid. I remember doing book 1. I remember a little about it, but I did like what I read of the Aeneid, and I was personally more fascinated with sort of Greek mythology. But anyway, Virgil and Heaney, that he remembers his Latin teacher saying, "Oh boys, I wish it could have been book 6." So I think it rises partly out of this strong attraction towards other cultures, other times, other periods. Yeah. I mean, that poem began air from another place and time. Mm-hmm. In a way, his imagination is being sort of re-ventilated and re-energized through these contacts. And in a sense, the link with Virgil, there's a very good interview I've actually got with me, which I could copy if you'd like it, where he talks about he talks about Virgil, and his version of Virgil sounds distinctly like Seamus Heaney. Mm-hmm. He's the kind of rural boy who comes good. He talks about him as being a scholarship boy. He gets to meet Maecenas, which is a bit like Heaney meeting Hobsbawm, and he gets to the court of Augustus. I'll leave you to sort of determine what the equivalent of the court of Augustus is, but maybe being friends with Bill Clinton is part of that, and the Empress of Japan. So there's that kind of identification with Virgil. I mean, I think it's been there from the outset. It's part of the, and again because of the Latin, I suppose there's also a link there with Latin culture and the language of the Mass too. that there's something sort of special and sacred about the language. At the same time, his version of Virgil is very much not the kind of lofty, high rhetorical Virgil. He sees Virgil as a very kind of accessible voice, and as I say, he does tend to translate these writers. And I think there's a strong link, obviously, Virgil, it was natural that he would come to at some stage. Previously it was Dante, and obviously there's that connection there. But this again is one of the things that is great about studying Seamus Heaney, is you get to meet so many other different voices. And so when I read that opening line of the Riverbank Field, as Loeb says, so I thought, right, let's get this edition of Loeb, and it turns out that the lines that Heaney quotes are identical to the lines in the Loeb, and so on and so on.
Yeah, so actually now that you've... Okay. Actually now, Chris, and you have me thinking about the poem Uncoupled, which we were looking at. Is there an echo of the passage in the book 6 of the Aeneid when Anchises addresses Maecenas, sees him in the throng of famous Romans to come, and addresses him in the who is this coming to the ash pit, and again, who is this not much higher than the cattle? Here we have Heaney talking about his parents, unglorious, the opposite of Maecenas, yes. Maecenas is this great hero who's the son of Augustus, who will die and never really quite reach his glory, if I'm remembering the passage correctly. And Anchises looks at him and glimpses him and says, "Oh, and who is this Maecenas who will die before his time?" And here is perversely mourning him 1,500 years before he's been born. Mm-hmm. But of course, Virgil is mourning him in the past. Anyway, I'm very. If I'm right in hearing an echo, there's something very interesting about appropriating those lines and applying them to your parents. Mm-hmm. Unglorious.
Well, they're constant references. I mean, I think the Riverbank Field poem and that whole sequence, Route 110, is obviously absolutely saturated in Virgilian references. And then it's sort of, this is why the chain, I'm using sort of water image now, I suppose, things sort of spill out from that core sequence, which was I think the first thing he wrote. I found out that he wrote these, say, before the stroke. Mm-hmm. So probably straight after District and Circle, he was already on that line, District and Circle line, for those of you who know London. And throughout there, these sense of the shades. I think probably in the last decade or so, with so many of his major substitute father figures. I mean, he's always had these sort of literary father figures in his career. It started with people like Kavanagh, again in terms of finding a writer who was very distinct and different from Yeats, who's closer in terms of links. But I think in the last decade, for example, the loss of people like Ted Hughes, Czeslaw Miłosz, and so on, even before the stroke, there's this strong sense of the shades drawing in, as it were. And this collection is full of shades and remembering the shades. And one of the things that Heaney does, and did in that poem 9 that I read, which is why I think it's quite important to do myself, is actually to name these people. So in short, yes, the Virgil obviously deeply important to him, and offering, as in the 1980s when he first came over here, the Polish writers, Czeslaw Miłosz, Zbigniew Herbert, people like that, Brańczak later on, Stanisław Brańczak, all people offering a different perspective, a different angle, a different place to take the music, as it were. Sorry.
I apologize, I'm losing my voice too, and I'm not a literary critic. But actually, I was fascinated by poem 9 that you began with. I don't know if you want to go back to that, but it struck me, and maybe this is overly simplistic. Like I said, I'm not a literary critic or a literary person. I'm a geologist. But it really struck me as the colon in there that's toward the end. really separated the poem into two different portions, and I saw it as very much sort of civilians and what was happening to the civilian versus the military, including beyond the colon, if I'm just referring to the poem, the military per se, the paramilitary, et cetera. But I wanted to ask you, and you were just mentioning specific names, those two individuals, O'Neill and Lavery, they were purely civilians, I assume, and I was wondering more. I was curious to know more about their background, how they were buried, how they were treated. You see where I'm going with this?
Yeah.
Because they really are individuals, and it struck me in that poem as real individuals.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's partly what gives that poem a great deal of force. That the names. These Mr. Lavery. He's simply somebody who owned a pub on the corner of Ashley Avenue, which the conference that Meg and I were at recently was just a few streets away from that. He simply, the fact was that at the time there were what was a legitimate target and what was not a legitimate target. There seems to be some blurring going on. Yeah. So the idea that, I have no idea why the provisionals would simply want to plant a bomb
I was curious
in this man's pub.
Yeah.
And the other case, Louis O'Neill, he's simply, he's a father of, I can't remember how many children he had, about 5 or 6 children, he's 49. He's simply on the, after Bloody Sunday, the IRA ordered a kind of curfew to take place as a sign of respect for the dead. The IRA were not, there was a minor official IRA presence at Bloody Sunday, but the IRA kept out of the march that ended in Bloody Sunday. But what happened was that Louis O'Neill, rather than doing as he was told and not going out, he was somebody who would like to go out for a drink. And several days after Bloody Sunday, he just went to this pub for a drink. Now, in the earlier version of when the first poem about O'Neill was a poem called Casualty from the 1978 collection, Heaney assumed, as a lot of people did at the time, that the pub where Louis O'Neill was drinking after hours, it was like a shebeen, they call it? He was drinking out of hours. And there was the assumption that the IRA had bombed it and killed these probably mostly Catholic people because they had broken the rules of the tribe. According to Lost Lives, which is a kind of memorialization of all the people who were killed in the Troubles, soldiers, civilians, and so on, it says that the bomb was almost certainly planted by loyalist paramilitaries. So there's a kind of balance there in terms of Republican atrocity and a loyalist atrocity. And what I liked about this poem was that Heaney is pretty clear without saying so. It seemed to me to be pretty clear that he was saying, this is absolutely appalling. And the Truth Commission is a bit like that in terms of what it's trying to do. It's absolutely appalling that these crimes were committed. There were so many innocent people whose lives were ruined. Thinking of that soldier, that 33-year-old Catholic soldier, Catholic policeman. I mean, in a way, it doesn't matter that he's a Catholic, but the fact that people from his own nationalist background have planted a bomb under his car, and he's now lost a leg, and the effect that's going to have on his family. The way in which you have that, and then at the end of the poem, as you say, there's this focus on the rituals that the paramilitaries who carried out these atrocities now enjoy. The sort of terrible injustice of it. And this again is why I think a writer like Miłosz was extremely important for Heaney to discover, again while he was over in America, and the way in which that sent him in a different direction. I'm sorry, it's probably a long answer.
No, that's excellent. Thank you.
We're running out of time a little bit, but is there another question from the audience? Yes.
I'm a freshman here. I'm studying film and mythology, so very much in the classicist very much from. And during my senior year of high school, I did a lot of research, and part of answering the question here that we talked about Virgil's Aeneid, because I had to translate book 6 in my Latin class, so I was one of the fortunate ones in Heaney's case. But with this, my parents were fortunate enough, they were in Cornell in the 80s, and they were fortunate enough to hear Heaney read from his the Old English of Beowulf, the epic, and in my opinion, the best translation of Beowulf. And also I had to compare Heaney to Keats in terms of the whole nature Dionysium, which we brought up in Uncoupled, with the ash pit and Ode to a Grecian Urn as well, and other things, and the kite with the spindle. So I was wondering, although we've answered the classicist side of how Heaney was very much connected, I was wondering if you could divulge a little more in the nature-oriented side of, like, for example, his poem Dig, in terms of
Digging, huh?
Yes, digging, and how Heaney was very much into the whole nature side, and as Keats was the romanticist side of Heaney.
This again is, in a way, it's kind of back to the problem of talking about Protestants and Catholics and English and Irish. I always feel slightly uneasy, when Robert Lowell said Heaney is the best Irish poet since Yeats. Yes, he is Irish, and I'll get onto the kind of countryside in a second as part of that. But at the same time, he comes from a distinct hybridic space, Northern Ireland, where, as I say, and it's part of his education, the poets that he first encounters are mostly going to be English ones, Shakespeare, Keats, and Wordsworth. And I think the reason why he bonded so much with those, with the Romantic writers and with that English tradition, and also a little later he discovers Kavanagh in 1961 after he's finished at university. He has lived this. He's lived this life on a farm, close to nature, with animals, with the countryside, and so when he's growing up and studying, there's a lot of kind of the British education system, which is full of kings and queens and major events, but at the same time there is this sense of, particularly in Romantic literature, obviously the importance of the environment. This is something that Michael Longley, especially a contemporary of Heaney's, has written a lot of poems that have a kind of ecological focus. There's actually one of the poems I didn't read and talk about. There is this kind of strong sense of the human chain is also the kind of interdependency with the ecosystem. That's beginning to emerge, I think, in some of the poems there. So there's this kind of close proximity to nature. There's this sense, as you say, within the poem Digging, that he comes from a tradition, he comes from a generational chain that lived by the soil, on the soil, with the soil, and through the breakage that occurred when he was sent away to boarding school in St. Colum's and exposed to what was they did learn Irish there, but it's predominantly still a kind of British education system and on to university. He's identifying at an early stage his voices, themes, concerns which he can identify with. So in other words, the romantic poets, I think, the English Romantic poets, as it were, are an important medium by which he can both be true to this change, this translated sense of himself that has come through education. At the same time, what he does is to use that education, that which has this strong British, English strain within it, and use it to turn back to articulate a strong sense of Irish identity. So in a way, what he's doing, this goes back to your point about the radical Heaney. In a way, what Heaney's doing is a kind of it's something similar in terms of the radical literary politics of someone like James Joyce, who he comes to at a slightly later stage. But it's I don't know if that answers your question, but so he comes from this. He has this. The first collection is called Death of a Naturalist. The that he has this strong attachment to nature, and then through the process of education, cultural development that he benefited from in school and at university, he has the means at his disposal through which he can re-explore that primary originary experience on the farm. He keeps going back to it and reimagining it. Yeah.
I think that's all we have time for today, but I'm grateful to Michael and I'm grateful to Sally and Chris for joining me here. But thank you for that splendid hour. Thank you.